call to 911 lasted only 42 seconds, but it changed everything. The dispatcher's voice remained steady, professional, trained for crisis. On the other end of the line, a woman spoke with measured urgency, her words careful, deliberate, as if she knew that every syllable mattered. She gave an address. She gave a room number. She said there was a child who needed help immediately, and then she said something that made the dispatcher sit forward in her chair. She said the injuries were hidden, concealed beneath clothing, and that someone had gone to great lengths to make sure no one would see them. The call ended. Silence filled the dispatch center for exactly 3 seconds before the response units were mobilized. Sirens began to wail across the city, cutting through the ordinary rhythm of a Tuesday morning. But before those sirens, before the flashing lights and the rush of emergency personnel, there was a classroom, there was a teacher, and there was a child no one had truly seen until it was almost too late. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy educational stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. The elementary school sat on the corner of Maple and 5th, a brick building with tall windows that let in the morning light. It had been there for 60 years, weathering generations of children, teachers, and the slow march of progress. The hallways smelled of old books and floor polish, and the walls were decorated with colorful artwork, handprints in paint, essays about what the students wanted to be when they grew up. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where parents volunteered for bake sales and teachers remembered the names of siblings who had graduated years before. It was safe. It was familiar. It was home to 500 children who arrived each morning with backpacks and lunch boxes, who learned multiplication tables and state capitals, who played kickball at recess and argued over who got to be line leader. Nothing bad was supposed to happen here. Mrs. Eleanor Hastings had been teaching at the school for 18 years. She was 47, with graying hair pulled back into a practical bun, and she wore cardigans even in spring because the old building never quite held the heat properly. She taught 4th grade, and she loved it. She loved the way 9-year-olds asked questions, how they still believed the world made sense, how they hadn't yet learned to hide their enthusiasm or their hurt. She had taught hundreds of students over the years, and she remembered most of them. She remembered the ones who struggled with reading and the ones who excelled in math. She remembered the shy ones and the loud ones and the ones who needed a little extra patience. She prided herself on noticing things, on seeing the small changes in behavior that might indicate trouble at home or problems with peers. She had called parents before when something seemed off. She had referred students to the school counselor when they showed signs of anxiety or depression. She believed deeply that her job was not just to teach fractions and grammar, but to protect the children in her care, to make sure they felt safe, to give them a place where they could be themselves without fear. She had never failed a child, not until now. The student's name was Jordan. Not a boy, not a girl in the way the other students seemed to define those things, but a quiet presence in the 3rd row, 2nd seat from the window. Jordan had been in Mrs. Hastings's class since September, and it was now late April. 7 months. 7 months of lessons and assignments, of group projects and spelling tests, of field trips and holiday parties. 7 months, and Mrs. Hastings realized, with a creeping sense of dread, that she knew almost nothing about Jordan at all. The child was neither exceptional nor disruptive. Grades were average. Attendance was near perfect. There had been no disciplinary issues, no calls home, no parent-teacher conferences that raised concerns. Jordan simply existed in the background, a shadow among brighter, louder children who demanded attention and got it. Mrs. Hastings had noticed Jordan, of course. She noticed all her students, but she hadn't truly seen. Not until this morning. It started with something small, the way these things always do. Jordan wouldn't sit down. The other students filed in at 8:15, chattering about a television show they'd watched the night before, and they dropped their backpacks and slid into their seats, ready for the morning announcements. But Jordan stood beside the desk, hands gripping the back of the chair, knuckles white. Mrs. Hastings was taking attendance and didn't notice at first. When she looked up, she saw Jordan standing and assumed the child was about to ask a question. "Jordan, please take your seat," she said, her tone gentle but firm. Jordan's eyes darted to her, then away. There was something in that glance, something Mrs. Hastings couldn't name. Fear, maybe, or pain. Jordan lowered into the chair slowly, so slowly it seemed to take an eternity, and when the child finally sat, there was a barely audible hiss of breath, a sound that might have been a gasp or a whimper. Mrs. Hastings frowned. She made a mental note but said nothing. The morning announcements crackled over the intercom, and the day began. By mid-morning, Mrs. Hastings had noticed 3 more things. Jordan refused to lean back in the chair, sitting rigidly forward, spine straight, as if the backrest didn't exist. During a math lesson when Mrs. Hastings asked the students to turn to page 73 in their textbooks, Jordan's hands trembled as they opened the book, and the child's breath came quick and shallow. And when it was time for recess, Jordan asked to stay inside. "I don't feel well," Jordan said, voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Hastings pressed the back of her hand to the child's forehead. "No fever." "What hurts?" she asked. Jordan looked at the floor. "Just my stomach." Mrs. Hastings let Jordan stay in during recess, sitting at a desk near the window, staring out at the playground where the other children ran and screamed and played. She watched the child for a moment. The way Jordan sat so still, so unnaturally still. And then she turned back to her grading. She told herself she was overreacting. Children got stomach aches. Children had bad days. It didn't mean anything. But after lunch, when the students returned to the classroom, Jordan stood again, and this time Mrs. Hastings walked over before the child could sit down. "Are you sure you're all right?" she asked, crouching beside the desk so she was at eye level. Jordan nodded, but the child's eyes were glassy, unfocused, and there was a tightness around the mouth that spoke of pain held in check. Mrs. Hastings reached out gently to touch Jordan's shoulder, and the child flinched so hard it was like an electric shock had passed through them. Mrs. Hastings pulled her hand back, her heart suddenly pounding. "Jordan," she said softly, "you can tell me if something's wrong." Jordan shook their head. "I'm fine." The words were automatic, rehearsed, and Mrs. Hastings felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard those words before, in other contexts, from other children, and they had never meant what they claimed to mean. She let Jordan sit down, but she didn't return to the front of the classroom. Instead, she moved to her desk and pulled out a notebook, the one she used to track observations about her students. She flipped to a blank page and began to write. Jordan refuses to sit normally, flinches at touch, trembling hands, avoids eye contact, stays inside during recess. She stared at the list, and the words stared back, accusing. How had she not noticed before? How long had this been going on? The afternoon dragged. Mrs. Hastings taught a social studies lesson on the 13 colonies, and the students worked on a project about colonial life, but she barely registered what she was saying. Her attention kept drifting to Jordan, who sat hunched over a piece of construction paper, coloring a picture of a log cabin with shaking hands. The other students worked in pairs, talking and laughing, but Jordan worked alone, silent, isolated. Mrs. Hastings had always thought of Jordan as independent, self-sufficient, but now she saw it differently. The child wasn't independent. The child was alone. At 2:30, during science, Mrs. Hastings asked the students to line up for a demonstration at the front of the room. They were learning about states of matter, and she had set up a small experiment with ice, water, and steam. The students crowded around, jostling for the best view, and Jordan stood at the back, arms wrapped around their torso as if holding something in. Mrs. Hastings demonstrated the experiment, explaining how heat caused molecules to move faster, how solid became liquid became gas. But her mind was elsewhere. She kept glancing at Jordan, and every time she did, she saw the same thing. The child's face was pale, almost gray, and there was a sheen of sweat on the forehead, despite the cool temperature of the room. When the experiment was over and the students returned to their seats, Jordan moved like someone much older, each step careful, measured, as if every movement caused pain. Mrs. Hastings made her decision. She walked to the intercom on the wall and pressed the button. "Mrs. Reynolds, this is Mrs. Hastings in room 12. Could you please send someone to cover my class for a few minutes? I need to speak with a student privately." The secretary's voice crackled back. "Of course. I'll send Mr. Lopez down right away." Mrs. Hastings released the button and turned to the class. "Continue working on your projects quietly, please. Mr. Lopez will be here in just a moment." She walked to Jordan's desk and crouched down again. "Jordan, I'd like to speak with you outside for just a minute. You're not in trouble. I just want to check in with you." Jordan's eyes widened, and for a moment Mrs. Hastings thought the child might refuse. But then Jordan nodded slowly and stood up, moving with that same painful deliberateness. They stepped into the hallway, and Mrs. Hastings closed the door behind them. The hallway was empty, lined with lockers and student artwork, and the silence was almost oppressive. She turned to Jordan and tried to smile, tried to seem calm and reassuring, but her hands were shaking. "Jordan," she said gently, "I've noticed you seem uncomfortable today. I want to help, but I need you to tell me what's wrong." Jordan stared at the floor, at the scuffed tiles that had been walked on by thousands of feet over decades. The child's shoulders were hunched, arms still wrapped protectively around the torso, and when Jordan spoke, the voice was so quiet Mrs. Hastings had to lean in to hear. "Nothing's wrong." Mrs. Hastings took a slow breath, choosing her words carefully. She had been trained for this, had attended workshops on recognizing signs of abuse, on how to talk to children who might be in danger. But knowing what to do in theory and actually doing it were two different things. Her mouth felt dry. "Jordan, I need you to be honest with me. Are you hurt?" The child's jaw tightened. "No. Are you in pain right now?" A pause, longer this time, and then a barely perceptible nod. Mrs. Hastings felt her chest tighten. "Where does it hurt?" Jordan's eyes filled with tears, but they didn't fall. The child blinked rapidly, fighting to hold them back. "Everywhere," Jordan whispered. "It hurts everywhere." Mrs. Hastings reached out slowly, telegraphing her movements so Jordan could see them coming, and gently placed a hand on the child's arm. This time Jordan didn't flinch, but the muscles beneath her hand were rigid, tense. "Can you tell me what happened?" Jordan shook their head violently. "I can't. Please don't make me." The tears finally spilled over, tracing paths down the pale cheeks, and Jordan's breath hitched in a way that sounded like it hurt. Mrs. Hastings felt her own eyes sting. She wanted to pull the child into a hug, to offer comfort, but something told her that physical contact might make things worse. Instead, she kept her hand on Jordan's arm, a light touch, a tether. "Sweetheart, I can't help you if you don't tell me what's going on, but I promise you, whatever it is, we're going to make it better. Okay?" Jordan looked up at her then, and the expression in those eyes was ancient, far too old for a 9-year-old. It was the look of someone who had learned not to trust promises, who had been let down too many times to believe that anyone could make things better. "Please don't make me sit," Jordan said, and the desperation in those words cut through Mrs. Hastings like a knife. "Please, it hurts too much." Mrs. Hastings nodded slowly. "Okay, you don't have to sit. But Jordan, I need to understand why it hurts. Did you fall? Did someone hurt you?" Jordan's gaze slid away, back to the floor. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Mrs. Hastings could hear the muffled voices of students in nearby classrooms, the distant ring of a telephone in the office, the hum of the ancient heating system that ran through the building's bones. Normal sounds. A normal day. Except nothing about this was normal. "Can I see?" Mrs. Hastings asked gently. "Can I look at where it hurts?" Jordan's head snapped up, eyes wide with fear. "No. No, you can't. I'll get in trouble." "You won't get in trouble, I promise." "Yes, I will. They said if anyone found out, it would be worse. They said they'd know if I told." Mrs. Hastings felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Someone had done this. Someone had hurt this child and threatened them to stay silent. She forced herself to stay calm, to keep her voice steady. "Jordan, listen to me very carefully. No one is going to hurt you again. I'm going to make sure of that. But I need to see what happened so I can help you. Can you trust me? Just this once." Jordan stared at her for a long moment, weighing the request, weighing the risk. Finally, the child nodded, so slightly it was almost imperceptible. "Okay," Jordan whispered, "but not here. Someone might see." Mrs. Hastings looked down the hallway. Mr. Lopez had arrived and was in her classroom now. She could hear his voice through the door. She made a quick decision. "Come with me." She led Jordan down the hallway to a small storage room that was used for art supplies. It was cramped, filled with shelves of construction paper and bottles of glue, but it was private. She flicked on the light and closed the door behind them. The single bulb cast harsh shadows across the small space. Jordan stood in the center of the room, looking smaller than ever, and Mrs. Hastings felt her heart break a little more. "Okay," she said softly. "Can you show me?" Jordan's hands moved to the hem of the uniform shirt, a plain blue polo that was part of the school's dress code. The child lifted it slowly, inch by inch, and Mrs. Hastings had to clench her jaw to keep from gasping. The child's back was a map of cruelty. Bruises in shades of purple, yellow, and green covered the skin, some old and fading, others fresh and angry. But it was worse than that. There were marks, thin lines crisscrossing the back, some scabbed over, others still raw. And there was something else, something that made Mrs. Hastings's stomach turn. Thin strips of cloth, like bandages, wrapped tightly around the child's torso, but they weren't medical bandages. They were dirty, stained, and they were tied so tightly that Jordan's breathing was shallow and labored. "Oh my God," Mrs. Hastings breathed, and she immediately regretted it because Jordan dropped the shirt and spun around, eyes wild with panic. "I'm sorry," the child said, words tumbling out in a rush. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to show you. Please don't tell, please, they'll be so mad. They'll—" "Jordan, stop." Mrs. Hastings kept her voice gentle but firm. "You have nothing to be sorry for, nothing. Do you understand me?" Jordan was crying openly now, body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and broken. Mrs. Hastings wanted to reach out, to hold the child, but she knew she needed to be careful. Instead, she knelt down so they were eye level. "Who did this to you?" Jordan shook their head, unable or unwilling to answer. "Was it someone at home?" A nod, almost invisible. "Is it your mom? Your dad?" Jordan's breath hitched. "Both," the child whispered. They said I was bad. They said I needed to learn. They said if I told anyone, they'd make sure I never saw my brother again. Mrs. Hastings felt rage, pure and incandescent, surge through her. But she pushed it down, forced herself to stay focused. How long has this been happening? Jordan's voice was hollow. I don't know. A long time since we moved here. They had moved to the district in September. 7 months. This had been going on for 7 months and no one had noticed. Mrs. Hastings had seen this child every day, and she hadn't noticed. The guilt was crushing, but she couldn't let it paralyze her now. She stood up and pulled her phone from her pocket. Jordan, I need to make a call. I need to get help for you. The child's eyes widened in terror. No, please, you can't. They'll know, They won't hurt you again, Mrs. Hastings said, and she hoped with everything in her that it was true. I'm going to make sure of that. But I need you to stay here with me and stay calm. Can you do that? Jordan nodded, but the panic was still there, just beneath the surface. Mrs. Hastings dialed 911. Her hand was shaking so badly she almost dropped the phone. The line rang once, twice, and then a voice answered, 911, what's your emergency? My name is Eleanor Hastings. I'm a teacher at Maple Elementary School. I have a student with severe injuries. I believe they're the result of ongoing abuse. We need help immediately. The dispatcher's voice sharpened, all business. What's your location? Mrs. Hastings gave the address, the room number, and a brief description of the injuries. She kept her voice low so Jordan wouldn't hear all the details. The dispatcher asked if the child was in immediate danger, and Mrs. Hastings glanced at Jordan, who was now sitting on the floor, knees pulled up to chest, rocking slightly. Not at this moment, but I believe if the parents are contacted, the situation will escalate. The child is terrified. Units are on the way. Stay with the child and keep them calm. Do not contact the parents. Do you understand? Yes. ETA is 6 minutes. Stay on the line if you can. I will. Mrs. Hastings lowered the phone and looked at Jordan. 6 minutes felt like an eternity. She moved to sit on the floor beside the child, not too close, giving space, but close enough to offer presence. They're coming to help, she said quietly. It's going to be okay. Jordan looked at her with those 2 old eyes. You don't know that. And Mrs. Hastings realized the child was right. She didn't know. She couldn't promise that everything would be okay, that the system would work, that Jordan would be safe. But she could promise to try. You're right, she said. I don't know for sure, but I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you're safe, and I'm not going to leave you. Not now. Not until I know you're somewhere you won't be hurt. Jordan's lip trembled. Why are you helping me? The question broke Mrs. Hastings' heart. What kind of life had this child lived where kindness was confusing, where help was unexpected? Because you deserve to be safe, she said simply. Because you're a child, and children should never be hurt like this. Because I care about you. The minutes ticked by. Mrs. Hastings kept the dispatcher on the line, giving updates, answering questions. Jordan sat silently, occasionally wiping at tears, breathing in shallow gasps that spoke of pain held barely in check. Outside the storage room, the school day continued. Students changed classes. Bells rang. Teachers taught lessons. No one knew that in this small, cramped space, something was unraveling, something dark and terrible that had been hidden for too long. At minute 4, Mrs. Hastings heard footsteps in the hallway, quick and purposeful. At minute 5, there was a knock on the door. She stood and opened it to find Principal Martinez, a tall woman with kind eyes and an air of competence, standing with a police officer. Mrs. Hastings, the principal said quietly. The authorities are here. Mrs. Hastings nodded and stepped aside. The officer, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a gentle demeanor, entered the room and immediately crouched down to Jordan's level, the same way Mrs. Hastings had. "Hey there," he said softly. "My name is Officer Davis. I'm here to help. Can you tell me your name?" Jordan looked at Mrs. Hastings, who nodded encouragingly. "Jordan," the child whispered. "Jordan, I need to make sure you're safe, okay? That means we're going to have some people look at your injuries and make sure you get the care you need. Is that all right with you?" Jordan nodded slowly. Officer Davis stood and spoke into his radio. "I need paramedics inside. We have a minor with visible injuries, possible abuse case. CPS needs to be notified." The radio crackled with a response, and within moments, 2 paramedics arrived with a stretcher and medical kit. They moved efficiently but gently, speaking in low voices to Jordan, asking permission before touching, before examining. Mrs. Hastings watched, feeling helpless and overwhelmed. One of the paramedics, a young woman with braided hair, carefully lifted Jordan's shirt again and took photos of the injuries with a camera, documenting everything. The other paramedic, an older man, checked Jordan's vital signs and asked questions about pain levels, about when the injuries occurred, about whether Jordan had eaten or drunk anything that day. Jordan answered in monosyllables, voice barely audible, and Mrs. Hastings could see the exhaustion written across the child's face. The paramedics conferred quietly, and then the woman turned to Officer Davis. "We need to transport. Some of these injuries are infected, and the binding around the torso is restricting breathing. This child needs immediate medical attention." Officer Davis nodded and turned to Principal Martinez. "I need you to pull the student's records, parent contact information, home address, any history of complaints or concerns. Do not contact the parents yet. We'll handle that." Principal Martinez's face was pale, but she nodded and left the room quickly. Officer Davis looked at Mrs. Hastings. "You're the one who called it in." "Yes. You did the right thing. Can you tell me what you observed?" Mrs. Hastings recounted the day, the refusal to sit, the trembling, the flinching, the private conversation, the moment when Jordan had lifted the shirt. Her voice remained steady. Clinical, but inside she was shaking. Officer Davis took notes, asked clarifying questions, and then asked if there was anyone else who might have noticed anything unusual. "I don't know," Mrs. Hastings admitted. "Jordan has always been quiet, withdrawn. I don't think anyone realized." She trailed off, the guilt creeping back in. Officer Davis seemed to sense it. "Kids like this, they're good at hiding. They've been taught to hide. This isn't your fault." But it felt like her fault. It felt like she had failed in the most fundamental way. The paramedics prepared to move Jordan to the stretcher, and the child suddenly grabbed Mrs. Hastings' hand. "Will you come with me?" Jordan asked, voice small and scared. Mrs. Hastings looked at Officer Davis, who nodded. "You can ride along if you're willing. It might help keep the child calm." "Of course I'll come," Mrs. Hastings said, squeezing Jordan's hand gently. They moved through the hallways of the school, past classrooms where students were bent over worksheets, past the library where a group was researching a project, past the office where Principal Martinez was on the phone, her expression grim. They exited through a side door to avoid drawing attention, and outside the bright afternoon sun felt surreal, almost offensive in its normalcy. An ambulance was parked at the curb, lights flashing but no sirens. The paramedics loaded Jordan into the back, and Mrs. Hastings climbed in behind, sitting on a small bench seat. Officer Davis closed the doors and tapped the side of the vehicle. "I'll follow in my unit and meet you at the hospital," he said through the window. The ambulance pulled away smoothly, and Mrs. Hastings found herself in a strange, suspended reality. The hum of the vehicle's engine and the quiet beep of medical monitors, the only sounds. Jordan lay on the stretcher, eyes closed, breathing through an oxygen mask the paramedic had placed over their face. The woman sat beside Jordan, checking vitals, adjusting the IV line she had inserted into the child's arm. She caught Mrs. Hastings' eye and gave a small, sad smile. "You probably saved this kid's life," she said quietly. Mrs. Hastings didn't know how to respond to that. She just nodded and looked down at her hands, which were still trembling. At the hospital, everything moved quickly. Jordan was wheeled into the emergency room and a team of doctors and nurses descended, asking questions, conducting examinations, ordering tests. Mrs. Hastings stood to the side, feeling out of place, but every time she started to leave, Jordan would look for her, and she would stay. A social worker arrived, a kind-faced woman named Ms. Chen, who introduced herself and explained that she would be handling Jordan's case going forward. She asked Mrs. Hastings to recount everything again, and Mrs. Hastings did, her voice growing hoarse. Officer Davis arrived and joined the conversation, adding his observations, and then another detective showed up, a woman named Detective Ramirez who specialized in child abuse cases. She was sharp-eyed and direct, and she asked Mrs. Hastings detailed questions about the injuries, about Jordan's behavior, about any previous concerns. "Did the child ever mention being afraid to go home?" Detective Ramirez asked. Mrs. Hastings thought back over the past months and realized with a sinking feeling that she couldn't remember Jordan ever talking about home. The child never shared stories about weekends or family dinners or vacations. It was as if home didn't exist in Jordan's world at school. "No," Mrs. Hastings said slowly, "Jordan never talked about home at all." Detective Ramirez made a note. "That's common. Kids in abusive situations compartmentalize. School becomes a safe space, and they don't bring home into it because that contaminates the safety." Mrs. Hastings felt another wave of guilt. She had seen Jordan's silence as shyness, as independence, when it had been survival. Detective Ramirez must have seen something in her expression because she leaned forward slightly. "Listen, I've been doing this for 15 years. The fact that you noticed at all, the fact that you acted, puts you ahead of most people. A lot of teachers would have chalked it up to a bad day and moved on. You didn't. You saw something was wrong and you didn't ignore it. That matters." Inside the examination room, a doctor was carefully removing the makeshift bandages from Jordan's torso. Mrs. Hastings couldn't see what was happening from where she stood in the hallway, but she could hear the doctor's low voice, the murmur of concern, the clink of instruments. After what felt like hours but was probably only 40 minutes, the doctor emerged, pulling off latex gloves. He was a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a set jaw. He looked at Officer Davis and Detective Ramirez. Multiple contusions, lacerations, and what appear to be burn marks. Some of the injuries are weeks old. Others are fresh. The binding around the torso was causing restricted breathing and has left abrasions. There's also evidence of malnutrition and dehydration. This child has been systematically abused over an extended period. The words hung in the air, stark and brutal. Officer Davis exhaled slowly. "What's the prognosis?" "Physically, the child will recover with proper care and treatment. The infections can be treated with antibiotics. The wounds will heal. Psychologically," the doctor trailed off, shaking his head, "that's going to take a lot longer. Maybe a lifetime." Detective Ramirez turned to Ms. Chen. "We need to move on the parents now. Do we have an address?" Ms. Chen nodded and handed over a file. "Home address is here. Father works night shifts at a warehouse. Mother is listed as unemployed. There's a younger sibling, a 6-year-old boy, also enrolled in the district." Detective Ramirez's expression hardened. "We need to get that boy out of there too. If they did this to one kid, there's no telling what the other one is going through." She looked at Officer Davis. "Let's go." They left quickly and Mrs. Hastings was alone with Ms. Chen in the waiting area. The social worker sat down beside her and offered a bottle of water from her bag. Mrs. Hastings took it gratefully and drank, realizing she hadn't had anything since her coffee that morning. "What happens now?" Mrs. Hastings asked. Ms. Chen sighed. "Jordan will be kept in the hospital for at least a few days while the injuries are treated. After that, the child will be placed in emergency foster care while the investigation continues. The parents will be arrested and charged. There will be a court case, probably a long one. Jordan will have to testify, which is going to be difficult. But the goal is to make sure Jordan and the brother are never in that house again." Mrs. Hastings nodded, trying to process it all. "Can I see Jordan?" "In a little bit. They're getting the child settled in a room. I'll let you know when it's okay to visit." Mrs. Hastings sat back in the uncomfortable waiting room chair and stared at the television mounted on the wall, showing a muted news program. She thought about Jordan's question earlier. "Why are you helping me?" It was such a simple question, but it revealed so much about the life this child had lived. A life where help was unexpected, where kindness was suspicious. She thought about all the times over the past 7 months when she could have noticed, should have noticed. The times Jordan had been late to class, moving stiffly. The times the child had worn long sleeves, even on warm days. The times Jordan had eaten lunch alone, quickly, as if afraid someone might take the food away. All the signs had been there. She just hadn't put them together. But she had now, and she had acted. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. An hour later, Ms. Chen found her in the waiting room and said Jordan was asking for her. Mrs. Hastings followed her down a sterile hallway to a private room. Inside, Jordan was tucked into a hospital bed, looking impossibly small against the white sheets. The child's back was bandaged and an IV drip ran into one arm. But the oxygen mask was gone, and Jordan's breathing seemed easier. Mrs. Hastings approached the bed slowly. "Hey," she said softly. Jordan's eyes opened and found hers. "Hi. How are you feeling?" "Tired, sore, but better, I think." Jordan paused, then added, "They gave me ice cream." Mrs. Hastings smiled despite everything. "That's good. What flavor?" "Chocolate. It was really good." For a moment they just looked at each other, and Mrs. Hastings felt a lump form in her throat. Jordan was still a child, still capable of finding joy in ice cream, despite everything. That resilience was both heartbreaking and hopeful. "I'm glad you're here," Jordan said quietly. "I was scared you wouldn't come back." "I'm not going anywhere," Mrs. Hastings said. "Not until I know you're okay." Jordan's eyes filled with tears again. "I don't understand why you care. No one else did." Mrs. Hastings sat down in the chair beside the bed. "A lot of people care, Jordan. You just haven't met them yet, but you will. And I care because you're my student, and because you're a brave, strong person who deserves so much better than what happened to you." Jordan looked away, out the window where the late afternoon sun was beginning to fade. "They said I was bad. They said I deserved it." "They were wrong," Mrs. Hastings said firmly. "You didn't deserve any of it. What they did was wrong. Do you understand me?" Jordan nodded slowly, but Mrs. Hastings could see the doubt still lingering. It would take time for Jordan to believe it, to internalize it. But time was something they had now. Time and safety and people who cared. Before Mrs. Hastings could say more, there was a commotion in the hallway, voices urgent and tense. She stood and moved to the door, and through the small window, she saw Detective Ramirez and Officer Davis with 2 people in handcuffs. A man and a woman, both disheveled, both shouting. The woman's voice cut through the noise. "Where's my kid? You can't take my kid." Detective Ramirez's response was cold. "Your child is safe, which is more than I can say for when they were with you." The man lunged forward, but Officer Davis restrained him easily. They were led away down the hallway, and Mrs. Hastings closed the door, blocking the sound. She turned back to Jordan, who had gone pale. "They're here," Jordan whispered. "They found me." Mrs. Hastings moved quickly back to the bedside and took Jordan's hand, holding it firmly. "They can't hurt you anymore," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "They're being arrested. They're going to jail. Do you hear me? They can't get to you." Jordan's breathing was rapid, eyes wide, but the child gripped Mrs. Hastings's hand like a lifeline. "You promise?" "I promise." A knock on the door made them both jump, but it was just Ms. Chen, slipping inside and closing the door behind her. She looked at Jordan with concern. "I heard the commotion. Are you okay?" Jordan nodded shakily. Ms. Chen sat down on the other side of the bed. "Jordan, those people are being taken to jail right now. They won't be coming back. You and your brother are safe now." Jordan's head jerked up. "Mason. They got Mason." "Your brother is safe," Ms. Chen confirmed. "Officers went to the house and brought him here too. He's being examined by doctors right now, just like you were. Would you like to see him when he's ready?" Jordan's eyes filled with tears, but this time they seemed different somehow, less afraid and more relieved. "Is he okay?" "Did they hurt him too?" Ms. Chen's expression softened with sadness. "He has some injuries, but he's going to be fine. You both are." Jordan's shoulders shook with silent sobs, and Mrs. Hastings gently squeezed the child's hand, letting Jordan cry, letting all the fear and pain and relief pour out. Ms. Chen pulled a tissue from a box on the bedside table and handed it over. "It's okay to cry," she said gently. "You've been so strong for so long. You don't have to be strong right now." Mrs. Hastings stayed at the hospital until visiting hours ended at 8 o'clock. By then, Jordan had been given pain medication and had fallen into a restless sleep. Ms. Chen walked her out to the parking lot, the night air cool and crisp. "Thank you for staying," Ms. Chen said. "It made a difference." Mrs. Hastings looked back at the hospital, at the lit windows. "What happens next?" "Tomorrow we'll start the process of finding a foster placement. Ideally, we'll keep Jordan and Mason together. There will be medical follow-ups, therapy, a lot of appointments. The criminal case will move forward. It's going to be a long road." Mrs. Hastings nodded. "Can I visit? I don't want Jordan to think I just disappeared." "Absolutely. I'll call you tomorrow with details." "And Mrs. Hastings." Miss Chen met her eyes. "You did something remarkable today. Don't forget that." Mrs. Hastings drove home in a daze, the events of the day replaying in her mind on an endless loop. When she walked into her small apartment, she barely registered her surroundings. She sat on the couch and stared at nothing, feeling the weight of everything settling over her like a heavy blanket. She didn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jordan's face, saw the injuries, heard the child's voice asking why she cared. She thought about all the other students she'd taught over the years, wondered if she'd missed signs before, wondered how many children were sitting in classrooms right now, hiding pain, too afraid to speak. The next morning, she returned to school. Principal Martinez called an emergency staff meeting before classes started, and in the teacher's lounge 24 educators gathered, their faces drawn with concern. Principal Martinez stood at the front, her expression grave. "As some of you may have heard, one of our students was removed from their home yesterday due to abuse. Mrs. Hastings was the one who recognized the signs and took action. I want to remind everyone that we are mandated reporters. If you see something, you say something, no matter how small it seems." She paused, looking around the room. "We're going to be implementing new protocols. Every teacher will undergo refresher training on recognizing abuse. We're going to be more vigilant, more proactive. This should never have gone on as long as it did." Mrs. Hastings felt every eye in the room turn to her, some sympathetic, some curious, some perhaps judging. She kept her gaze forward, refusing to let the guilt swallow her whole. After the meeting, several teachers approached her, offering support, asking if she was okay. She answered automatically, saying she was fine, that she was just glad the child was safe. But inside, she was far from fine. She returned to her classroom and found her students already filing in, chattering and laughing, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded the day before. They noticed Jordan's empty desk, and several asked where Jordan was. Mrs. Hastings had prepared for this. "Jordan is going to be out for a little while," she said carefully, "but Jordan is safe and being taken care of." A girl named Emma raised her hand. "Is Jordan sick?" "Jordan is getting some help and will be back when ready," Mrs. Hastings said, keeping her tone light. "In the meantime, let's focus on our lessons." But throughout the day, she found herself staring at Jordan's empty desk, feeling the absence like a physical thing. That afternoon, Ms. Chen called. "Jordan is asking for you. Do you have time to visit this evening?" Mrs. Hastings didn't hesitate. "Yes." "What time?" She arrived at the hospital at 6 and found Jordan sitting up in bed, looking slightly better. The color had returned to the child's cheeks, and the tight, pained expression had eased somewhat. Mason was there too, a small 6-year-old with dark hair and wide eyes, sitting in a chair beside the bed. When Jordan saw Mrs. Hastings, the child's face lit up. "You came back." "Of course I did," Mrs. Hastings said, pulling up another chair. "I said I would." She looked at Mason. "You must be Jordan's brother." Mason nodded shyly. "I'm Mason." "It's very nice to meet you, Mason. I'm Mrs. Hastings. I teach Jordan at school." Mason looked at his older sibling. "Jordan talks about you sometimes, says you're nice." Mrs. Hastings felt her throat tighten. "Well, Jordan is pretty great too." The three of them talked for a while, about nothing and everything. Jordan told Mason about the ice cream, and Mason said he'd gotten strawberry. They talked about what they wanted to watch on the hospital television, and Mason said he liked cartoons. Jordan rolled their eyes but smiled. It was such a normal sibling moment that Mrs. Hastings felt tears prick her eyes. These were just kids. They should have been worried about homework and what was for dinner, not recovering from years of abuse. Ms. Chen appeared in the doorway. "I have some good news," she said, smiling. "We found a foster placement that can take both of you, a couple, the Andersons, who have experience with trauma cases. They're excited to meet you." Jordan's expression turned wary. "Are they nice?" "They're very nice," Ms. Chen assured. "And if it doesn't work out, we'll find somewhere else." "But I think you're going to like them." Mason looked at Jordan. "Will we get our own rooms?" Ms. Chen nodded. "You will, and they have a big backyard with a swing set." For the first time since Mrs. Hastings had met Jordan, she saw something that looked like hope flicker across the child's face. It was tentative, fragile, but it was there. Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Hastings visited regularly. She brought homework so Jordan wouldn't fall behind, though she made it clear there was no pressure. She brought books and puzzles and small toys for Mason. She met the Andersons, a warm couple in their 50s, who hugged the children carefully and spoke to them with gentle respect. She watched as Jordan and Mason slowly began to relax, to laugh a little more easily, to trust a little more readily. The criminal case moved forward. Mrs. Hastings was called to testify at a preliminary hearing, where she recounted everything she'd observed. She didn't have to see the parents, thankfully, but she knew they were there, in the courtroom, listening. The prosecutor told her later that her testimony had been crucial, that it had helped establish a timeline and pattern of abuse. The parents were denied bail. They would remain in custody until trial. Jordan had to testify too, eventually, in a closed session with only the judge, attorneys, and a victim advocate present. Ms. Chen said Jordan had been brave, had told the truth. but it had been hard. Afterward, Jordan had nightmares for several nights, waking up screaming. But the Andersons were patient, sitting with Jordan, reassuring the child, and slowly the nightmares became less frequent. Therapy helped. Jordan saw a counselor twice a week, working through the trauma, learning that the abuse hadn't been deserved, that it hadn't been Jordan's fault. It was slow progress, but it was progress. 3 months after that terrible day, Jordan returned to school. Mrs. Hastings had prepared the class, explaining in age-appropriate terms that Jordan had been going through a difficult time but was ready to come back, and that everyone should be kind and welcoming. When Jordan walked into the classroom that first morning, the other students cheered. Emma ran up and hugged Jordan, and several other kids crowded around saying they'd missed them, asking if Jordan wanted to sit with them at lunch. Jordan looked overwhelmed but happy, and when the child caught Mrs. Hastings' eye, Jordan mouthed, "Thank you." Mrs. Hastings smiled and mouthed back, "You're welcome." The school year ended a month later. On the last day after the final bell rang and the students poured out into the summer sunshine, Jordan lingered behind. Mrs. Hastings was packing up her desk, putting away supplies, when she noticed the child standing by the door. "Hey, Jordan, did you forget something?" Jordan shook their head and walked over, holding out a piece of paper. "I made this for you." Mrs. Hastings took it. It was a drawing colored in crayon, showing 2 figures holding hands. One was labeled Mrs. Hastings and the other Jordan. Above them, in careful lettering, Jordan had written, "Thank you for seeing me." Mrs. Hastings felt tears spill over before she could stop them. She looked at Jordan, who was watching her nervously. "This is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Jordan smiled, a real, genuine smile. "You saved me," the child said simply. "I just wanted you to know that I know that." Mrs. Hastings knelt down and opened her arms, and Jordan stepped into the hug. They stood like that for a long moment, teacher and student, 2 people who had been through something terrible together and had come out the other side. When they finally pulled apart, Mrs. Hastings wiped her eyes. "You saved yourself, Jordan. You were brave enough to let me help. That took so much courage." Jordan shrugged, suddenly shy. "I was scared. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the thing anyway." Jordan considered this, then nodded. "I'm going to try to be brave more often." "I think you already are." Jordan waved and left, and Mrs. Hastings watched through the window as the child met up with the Andersons in the parking lot. Mrs. Anderson ruffled Jordan's hair, and Mason came running up with a backpack that looked comically large on his small frame. They all piled into the car, a normal family doing normal things, and drove away. Mrs. Hastings stood there for a long time, holding the drawing, thinking about everything that had happened, everything that could have happened if she hadn't paid attention, if she hadn't acted. The trial took place that fall. Both parents were found guilty on multiple counts of child abuse, assault, and neglect. They were sentenced to 15 years in prison. Jordan and Mason were legally freed for adoption, and the Andersons began the process of making it official. Mrs. Hastings attended the adoption hearing, sitting in the back of the courtroom, watching as the judge declared Jordan and Mason officially part of the Anderson family. Afterward, there was a small celebration at the Andersons' house. Jordan introduced Mrs. Hastings to new friends from the neighborhood, showed her the bedroom with posters on the walls and books on the shelves, told her about the summer camp they'd be attending and the soccer league they'd joined. Mason dragged her outside to show off how high he could swing. It was chaotic and loud and wonderful, and Mrs. Hastings felt something in her chest loosen, something she hadn't realized she'd been holding tense. These kids were going to be okay. They had a long road ahead, years of healing, but they were surrounded by people who loved them, who would fight for them, who would keep them safe. As she was leaving, Jordan walked her to her car. "Are you going to be my teacher again this year?" Jordan asked. "No, you're in 5th grade now. You'll have Mr. Patterson." Jordan made a face. "I heard he gives a lot of homework." Mrs. Hastings laughed. "He does, but he's a good teacher. You'll like him." "Will I still see you?" "Of course. I'm not going anywhere. You can come visit my classroom any time, and I want to hear all about 5th grade." Jordan grinned. "Deal." They hugged goodbye and Mrs. Hastings got in her car. As she drove away, she looked in the rearview mirror and saw Jordan waving, standing in the driveway of a home where the child was safe, loved, wanted. She thought about that morning in April, about the moment she'd decided to pay attention, to act, to not look away. She thought about how close it had been, how easily she could have dismissed her concerns, how different things could have been. The weight of that responsibility, the knowledge that a child's life had hung in the balance of her choice to care, was something she would carry forever. But she would carry it willingly, because this was the job. Not just teaching fractions and grammar, but seeing the children in front of her, truly seeing them, and doing whatever it took to keep them safe. Over the years that followed, Mrs. Hastings stayed in touch with Jordan and Mason. She attended school plays and soccer games and birthday parties. She watched them grow, watched them heal, watched them become the people they were always meant to be. Jordan graduated high school with honors and went to college to study social work, determined to help other kids like they had been helped. Mason became a teacher himself, working with elementary students, saying he wanted to be someone kids could trust. Mrs. Hastings retired eventually, after 30 years in the classroom. At her retirement party, Jordan and Mason were there, adults now, successful and happy. Jordan gave a speech, talking about the teacher who had noticed, who had cared, who had saved a life by simply paying attention. And Mrs. Hastings understood, finally, that the guilt she'd carried for so long, the weight of wondering if she'd missed other signs, other children, was something she could set down. She couldn't change the past, but she had changed a future, Jordan's future, Mason's future, and maybe that was enough. The story of what happened that April day spread through the school district, through the community. It became a cautionary tale and a hopeful one, a reminder that vigilance mattered, that every teacher, every adult who worked with children had the power and the responsibility to notice, to act, to protect. New training programs were implemented, new protocols were established, and while it couldn't save every child, couldn't fix every problem, it made a difference. Because that's what small actions do. They ripple outward, touching lives in ways we can't always see or measure. One teacher noticing one child created a wave that spread far beyond that single moment. And somewhere in classrooms and homes and communities, other children were being seen, being helped, being saved. If you found this story moving, if it made you think about the children in your own life, in your own community, then take a moment right now to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Share this with someone who works with kids, with someone who needs to hear it, with someone who might be that person who notices. Drop a comment below telling us your thoughts, your own experiences, or just where you're watching from. These stories matter. Your engagement helps us continue sharing them. And if you see something, if you notice something that doesn't seem right, don't ignore it. Be the person who acts. Be the person who cares. Because you might just save a life.